since we're closing out the summit, I promise we'll find something positive to say about viewability. But let's start with the challenges. Where does it rank in terms of challenges to your business, Mike?
For the Daily Beast, I would say it's a little bit less of a challenge than other publishers, only because such a significant percentage of our revenue comes from content marketing, generally. So we care about it, but we feel pretty well positioned if it becomes a bigger and bigger issue, which we think it will, which is part of the reason that we moved to content marketing a couple years ago.
So that was one of the drivers.
Absolutely.
The concern about viewability.
Absolutely. Well, not just viewability generally, but also what we're seeing on both the ad tech side and the agency and brand side in terms of factors that we couldn't control. So the simplest way for us to control the greatest percentage of our revenue was to move into a kind of advertising and marketing where we control not the whole widget, but pretty close to it.
Stuart, for Time Inc., how big of a challenge is viewability on a scale of 1 to 10?
You know, it's a priority. So it can be challenging on the 1 to 10 scale. If you asked me this when we got started with the IAB and MRC a year and a half to 2 years ago, I'd say, you know, it's a 10 or 8 to 10. Now it's more probably about a 3 to 5. It's a big priority for us, and it's not a research or an analytics priority. It's a company-wide priority because our senior management had said it's critical that our advertisers' message be received. So for us, it's somewhat challenging because, and we'll get to all the issues around it, but we've made inroads, so we're happy about that, but we're not quite there yet.
Where do you see the agency-publisher relations? How far apart are they? They were demanding, like 6 to 9 months ago, they were demanding 100% viewability and banging the table.
And we still get that. Certainly, we still get that. I think both sides have gotten smarter just through experience, but you know, it's still a conversation. The IAB back in July restated the 70% threshold as being a reasonable one at this point, but it's still a conversation, and we're measuring ourselves to that MRC standard. We're also measuring ourselves against the Group M standard as well to ensure that, you know, we're making the improvements and setting the bar as high as we can.
But if they're asking for 100% viewability, what does that mean in practice? Does that mean that you have to serve a campaign over and over and over again?
Well, I mean, there is the issue of make goods, and we certainly don't want to be in that kind of business where we're serving impressions rather than serving advertisers and audiences. So there still is some of that goes on, certainly. But what we're learning through the data and working with the agencies is hand-holding in a good way, a partnership to understand what the data means, where the shortfalls are, et cetera. So, you know, we're both sides are getting smarter about expectations, I think.
What are you seeing, Mike? How far apart are you from the agencies? How far apart are the expectations and the measurement?
Very far apart. Specifically for measurement reasons. Our view is, and I think it's demonstrably true, that the data infrastructure for the industry, whether you're at an agency or a brand or at a publisher, just isn't there yet to be able to, from the agency side, demand 100% viewability and have that be something that a publisher can measure in the same way, right? We spend 2/3 of our conversations when we launch campaigns with advertisers around which standard of viewability are we going to use. And we went through this whole long process. We ran 4 or 5 different viewability measurement companies on our site. And the difference that we saw measuring the same thing was up to 400%. So when we have an agency come to us and say, we're using viewability model X, and we know what the impact would potentially be on our CPM or our eCPM, right? So if we have a 100% viewability campaign, right, we know that depending on the ad unit they choose, unless they're using the same viewability standard that we're using, could drop our eCPM by 25 to 75%. And that's purely because the data doesn't sync up publisher to publisher or measurement company to measurement company. So we try to spend a lot of time moving the conversation with agencies because, as I mentioned, we're predominantly a content marketing, advertising-oriented shop. And therefore, about 70 to 80% of most of our deals are in content marketing, not in display. But what do the agencies want to talk about? Viewability around less than 20% of the overall spend. So we try to get agencies to look at, well, let's talk about content viewability. Let's talk about content promotion viewability and look at viewability as broadly as possible because we feel like it's a little bit myopic in some instances.
And just to build on that a little bit, it's critical what we've found, you mentioned conversation, is that those conversations happen as far upstream as possible. And that's been an issue in the sense that we need to understand how we're being measured, how we're being evaluated as far upstream as possible. What are the KPIs? And then understanding, okay, they're using X and we're using Y. What are the differences that we can expect before we even measure it? And we're getting smarter about that, but you're right that there are still some significant discrepancies that are occurring.
So talk about that. What does that mean when you say we need to introduce the idea further upstream? What does that mean?
Well, ideally, and this could be the ideal, even before you get the IO, you want to be having these conversations. So, and I mean, these agencies aren't new to us. This isn't our first conversation we're having about it. So hopefully through experience, through exposure to the data, through doing some CSI work with the agency as well as the vendors, understand where these discrepancies come from. They could be as complex as, well, one vendor is interpreting the viewability standard this way while another is interpreting that way, or it could be as simple as, well, your data is global, my data is US only. So it's really, it's having that conversation and the experience to know what the distinctions are and differences are between these vendors.
I think just one point to add, the upstream answer for us is how early do you introduce pricing as it relates to viewability, right? In too many conversations, viewability is a binary, right? You're either delivering 100% viewability or I'm not paying for it. What we try to introduce even before a campaign conversation turns to viewability is we're just going to tell you right up front, the higher the viewability you demand, the higher price you have to pay. It's just more valuable inventory.
Right.
And then we kind of put it back on the agencies and say, if you want 100% viewability, that's fine, but we still have to be made whole based on the performance.
And what kind of acceptance or pushback are you getting on that? Are you getting them?
I would say
Which of the tiers
positive.
are they going with?
We've had probably the most common instance. I mean, basically, so everybody knows what we do. We start at 70. When we go to 80, we go to 90, we go to 100, right? And then depending on the goal or depending on the portion of the campaign we're talking about, we just have a dialogue, right? Do you really want 100% on this, even if it means you're over-delivering against this message? And I would say overall, though not exclusively, the conversation has been strong. Because it's basically an outcomes conversation. And in that regard, we're aligned.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you could talk numbers, but what percentage end up paying for 100%?
I would say we've had, in a minority of instances, we've had campaigns where an agency has said, we want 100%, and they've stuck at 100%. So I would say the majority of the time, that conversation has led to a decrease. Has it led to a 30-point decrease? No. Does it go from 100 to 70? Never. Does it go from 100 to 90, and then someone says 100 to 80? Yeah.
We've been hearing a lot at this summit about the role of ad tech and how they're kind of, weighing down the publishing process. What role do they play in the viewability conversation?
I think that's a good question because I think this is under-discussed, right? We're all kind of used to the ad tech that delivers ads. That's fine, but we need to reevaluate it again as we get further and further into a world in which we have to grapple with high viewability requirements because, and no offense to any ad tech company in here, but the old mantra of, it's just a line of code that you have to put on your site. It never has happened in my experience. So apologies if some of you have said that to me, but that's always a red flag. And my point is not to say that anyone is being disingenuous, but the reality is as we move further into the viewability world, we're entering an era where publishers, brands in terms of creative, and especially ad tech, since they're at the beginning of the delivery chain, have to be much more operationally excellent, right? A tip for ad tech folks that come in and talk to the Daily Beast, I made the joke about, it's just a line of code on the site and it works. But the really important thing that we look for is not some newfangled feature that none of your competitors have. What we look for is operational excellence. And for us, that is essentially speed. Because when we line up our different ad tech providers and we look at delivering an ad, even if it's going well, you're still looking at between a third and a half a second delay in some instances before it even gets to our page and renders. That's an enormous amount of time when it comes to viewability. If you have 100% viewability, I can't pay for that third to half a second before it even gets to our page, because it drops our viewability by 20 to 30%.
I would absolutely second that. For us, improvement has been really around two big buckets, design and technology. And in particular, when I think about technology and the impact on viewability, it's really, the emphasis is on speed. And that's been critical for us in understanding how we're lagging, because the numbers you threw out are spot on. What seems really small in the viewability world can have a big impact and a big monetary impact as well.
So what changes have you made at Time Inc.'s websites that have been with an eye toward improving viewability, whether it's site design or ad unit updates?
Sure. So we've been redesigning our sites like Time and Sports Illustrated, People, etc., and moving to a responsive design system. And when it comes to viewability, you kind of have to assume away some simple notions like above the fold good, below the fold bad, right? It's not to say there aren't differences, but we learned quite early on. We had a 728 by 90 unit on the home page, above the brand banner, looked great, and the viewability wasn't where it should be, and you'd expect it to be quite high. And the reason, and we learned this pretty quickly, was one simple click by a viewer on their scroll wheel of the mouse moves them better than 100 pixels away. So we had to shift it down and put it below the branding bar. We moved to 2 iframes, one a content well, one a nav well, and we did that and designed within each well what we believe to be an optimal advertising experience that aligns with how our audiences are consuming content. So we look at web analytics data, but also do things like usability research and eye tracking to understand what that content and consumption flow is. And then on the tech side, another quick but important fix, maybe quick is too simplistic a word, but an important fix is around just not auto refreshing to tabs that are inactive. And that is it's like, well, duh, but talking to your tech folk and your site design people, that's a discussion, but it has great ROI when it comes to viewability, having that kind of impact.
So you're making all these changes and with an eye toward improving viewability, but you probably both have agencies saying, we want the next big thing, we want something that's never been done before, we want new units, immersive or takeover units that are very innovative. How much does that go counter to the goals of viewability?
I would say, especially as you think of it device by device, almost entirely. The NBDB, never been done before request is something we get, not daily, but certainly weekly. And almost always it's coming from a place of what can you do on your desktop, right, versus your mobile site. And so what we try to do is instead, again, guide that conversation toward, well, what do you want to do on mobile, right? Because that's 60% plus of our audience. And the reality is, as it relates to the design piece, this is also quite interesting, is that laptops, laptops, not desktops, but as a percentage of overall desktop computing, laptops are an ever larger percentage. Those screens are ever smaller, right? So when you talk about viewability, especially 100% or even 90% viewability, you're talking about a browser window that is probably smaller in terms of vertical height than a 600 by 300 pixel ad. So when you have conversations about those kinds of never been done before, like whiz bang takeovers, you're really talking about probably for us, like less than 20% of our audience. So we just try to reorganize those conversations toward the way people actually behave, not the way that we wish they did.
How do those conversations go? Is that a hard
That one doesn't go so
sell?
well right now. That one doesn't go so well. Never been done before is ingrained in the RFP culture, as we know. But that then puts a lot of pressure on publishers. Come up with something better that works for agencies and works for your users on a mobile device. Right? Because at the end of the day, they want a beautiful object that still interrupts people, but that is the most pleasing interruption possible, if that's possible. And it's very difficult to make good on that on mobile devices, but we're starting to see some things that are interesting. So that's on publishers.
Any questions for Mike or Stuart? Yeah.
One of the challenges with viewability is the ad sizes themselves, right? You take 70%, 80% viewability, it's a flat GIF, or it's expandable rich media ad.
Right.
That takes a lot longer to load. Viewability will be different. What is your experience? Have you approached agencies around some of these conversations as you're negotiating viewability agreements?
Well, with our site design, I think we tried to take into account, based on the data, because we're measuring all display, mobile and desktop. We're trying to take into account, okay, what's working the best. And we're not putting blinders on as far as what's working the best in terms of viewability, because that, to us, that's just the start, right? It's about engagement, effectiveness, and granted, viewability is a prereq to that. But we're looking at all the metrics that come in terms of those interactions. And you're right about rich media. That's a great example, and gets back to that load speed. You want to give a great experience, and you're handcuffed by how quickly you can serve that ad. So that's something we're in consideration, because you want to provide a beautiful experience, but at the same time, you don't want to undermine, what you're doing. So we're taking a look at, as we speak, not just at the viewability data, but then marrying that to all the effectiveness, whether it's the interactions with the ad as well as branding impact, because that's what we're in the business of doing. So we're taking a look at all that data to come up with some best practices for all our brands around what it is we could or should be doing in terms of ad formats. So I don't have the magic answer yet, but absolutely a strong consideration for us.
I can just add one minor thing to that. I hate large ads, like in terms of their size, because I actually see no data that shows that they work better in terms of the intentionality of the user. Yes, some are impossible to avoid, and you accidentally click through by trying to close it, by clicking anywhere. But what we started to do is, because we do so much content marketing, we don't even want to get into the debate about ad size with the creatives at the agency. So what we say is, when we do the content marketing, when we do branded or sponsored content, we will handle the creative for that surrounds that for display. And we always do the same thing. It is flat. It is literally the lightest ad you can do for the ad size. Those always outperform, always. And you only have to show that once to a given media team side by side before we say the creative that you spent months doing worked worse than us taking that, cutting it down to a very simple flat ad. So we just have to prove it.
Other question?
Can I just ask, what percentage, if any, of customers do you fire? Like, and is it growing? So, just curious. So, what percentage of customers do you fire because they don't work within this model? And is it growing? I mean, maybe it's zero, but I'm just curious.
So I'll take a crack at that and try not to be glib about it. Publishers, especially if you're in like a journalism category like the Daily Beast is, it's expensive to produce quality journalism. So while we're not in a position to just like fire our customers, what we have done is go back to agency by agency and say, these are the minimum parameters by which we are willing to do a deal with you. Because when we did this analysis over the past we finished it maybe a month ago, over the past 3 years, there were instances where we lost money on a deal when you think about resources overall. So now we just avoid that entirely by saying this is the opening bid for us to do a deal.
Great. Oh, one more question?
Question about site speed. Everyone talks about it, but I think for non-tech people, it's very hard to measure. So do you guys have any ways for you to measure? Because it's really contingent on the device and the country and the location, and if it's 4G, 3G, or whatever. Any thoughts on that one?
A couple. You're right. It's incredibly difficult because, again, we don't control the whole widget. So we look at two different things. We look at what's happening on our servers. How fast are we pushing things down, right? How long does that take to get there? And yes, that isn't entirely within our control, but most of that measurement is. And then we look at bounce rate by device, by browser, by user, by time, by template. That tells us overall what kind of universe we're playing within. Now, there are lots of reasons for bounce rate. But we find that when we speed up a template on a device in a browser, when we speed up its delivery, that's the #1 predictor of decreasing bounce rate. So that's how we look at it.
The first one, that's usually what the dev team looks at, free screen,
Yeah.
free screen.
Yeah.
Do they give that for your product versus the other stakeholders?
Yeah.
So they can understand it?
Yep. But we try to keep it really simple, right? Like we have tiers, and we say green is good, yellow is okay, red is bad, right? Huge innovation. But what we just try to tell everybody in editorial and in sales is this is a good range. You can look at that dashboard anytime, but this is what we want. Ad sales, when your ad goes on that page and it drops to yellow, that's on you. Editorial, when you put in this huge like interactive map that you wanted to do and it drops to red, that's on you. So people understand the impact of their decisions.
No. We're 4 minutes over.
Actually,
Sorry.
we're afraid we're out of time. But thank you so much.
Thank you. He'll be around.
Thanks,
He's here.
everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. All right.